simply be partial to some tiny group and simply live out your moral life in that. That's not morally permissible. But you can't abandon your local group either, because that would take you too far away, I think, from your humanity. So what we have to do is to learn how to do both.
Aristotle had the ingredients of a theory of justice that I think is very powerful, and that is that it's the job of a good political arrangement to provide each and every person with what they need to become capable of living rich and flourishing human lives. Now, of course, he didn't include all the people, but he at least had that idea of supporting human capability. That's the foundation of my own approach. Now then, in the 17th and 18th centuries, a very powerful new approach came on the scene, and that was the social contract approach. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant. The social contract approach was inspired by the background culture of feudalism, where all opportunities were distributed unequally to people according to their class, their inherited wealth, and their status. And so what these theorists said is, try to imagine human beings stripped of all those inherited advantages, placed in what they called the state of nature, where they had only their natural body and their physical advantages, and try to imagine what kind of arrangements they would actually make. The social contract tradition is, of course, an academic, philosophical tradition, but it also has tremendous influence on popular culture and our general public life, because every day we hear things like, oh, those people don't pay their own way, or supporting some new group of people, well, they'll be a drag on our economy. So the idea that the good member of society is a producer who contributes advantage to everyone, that is a very live idea, and it lies behind the decline of welfare programs in this country. I think it lies behind many Americans' skepticism about Europe, about European social democracy. You hear terms like, oh, the nanny state, as though there was something wrong with the idea of maternal care as a conception of what society actually does. We also see it in another way in images of who the real man is. The real man is sort of like these people in the state of nature. He doesn't deeply need anyone. He isn't bound to anyone by ties of love and compassion. He's the loner who can go his own way, and then out of advantage, he'll choose to have certain kinds of social arrangements. The theorists of the social contract made certain assumptions that aren't always true. They assumed that the parties to this contract really are roughly equal in physical and mental power. Now, that was fine when you're thinking about adult men with no disabilities. But as some of them already began to notice, it doesn't do so well when you think about women, because women's oppression has always been partly occasioned by their physical weakness compared to men. And so if you leave out that physical asymmetry, you may be leaving out a problem that a theory of justice will need to fix. But it certainly does not do well when we think about justice for people with serious physical and mental disabilities. And in fact, some of the theorists who noticed that said, well, this is a problem, but we'll just have to solve it later. We'll get the theory first, then we'll work on this problem at some other point. Well, my thought is that this is not a small problem. There are a lot of people with serious physical and mental disabilities, but not only that, but it's all of us when we're little children and as we age. How do you think about justice when you're dealing with bodies that are very, very unequal in their ability and their power? And perhaps even harder, how do you think about it when you're dealing with mental powers that are very, very unequal in their potential? And I think that this is a really serious political problem. We have only just begun to understand how to educate children with disabilities, how to think about their political representation, how to design cities that are open to them. I mean, this bridge we walked across, a person in a wheelchair can go over that bridge. But, 50 years ago, that would not have been the case. There would have been steps, and that person could not get to see this beautiful lakeshore. Capabilities approach, as I've developed it as a theory of justice, begins with the idea that all human beings have an inherent dignity and require life circumstances that are worthy of that dignity. The areas of life that seem to me particularly important when we think about the capabilities are, of course, life, is the very most basic one, bodily health, bodily integrity, the development of the senses, imagination, and thought, the development of practical reasoning, the development of affiliations, both more informal in the family and friendship, but also in the political community, the development of the ability to play and have recreational opportunities, the ability to have relationships with other creatures and the world of nature, developing emotional capabilities, because I think a lot of theories leave out the fact that we don't want to have lives that are filled with fear, for example. In my view, people get together to form a society, not because they're afraid and they want to strike a deal for mutual advantage, but it's much more out of love that they want to join with others in creating a world that's as good as it can be.
So, do you have to go to school to be a philosopher?
Oh, God, no. Thank God you don't have to go to school. No, a philosopher's a lover of wisdom. It takes tremendous discipline, takes tremendous courage to think for yourself, to examine yourself. That Socratic imperative of examining yourself requires courage. William Butler Yeats used to say, it takes more courage to examine the dark corners of your own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Courage to think critically. You can't talk. Courage is the enabling virtue for any philosopher, for any human being, I think, in the end. Courage to think, courage to love, courage to hope. Plato says philosophy is a meditation on and a preparation for death. And by death, what he means is not an event, but a death in life, because there's no rebirth, there's no change, there's no transformation without death. And therefore the question becomes, how do you learn how to die? And of course, Montaigne talks about that, his famous essay, to philosophize is to learn how to die. You can't talk about truth without talking about learning how to die. And I believe that Theodore Adorno was right when he says that the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. That gives it an existential emphasis, you see. so that we're really talking about truth as a way of life as opposed to simply truth as a set of propositions that correspond to a set of things in the world. Human beings are unable to ever gain any monopoly on truth, capital T. We might have access to truth, small t, but they're fallible claims about truth. We could be wrong. We have to be open to revision and so on. So there is a certain kind of mystery that goes hand in hand with truth. This is why so many of the existential thinkers, be they religious like Meister Eckhart or Paul Tillich, or be they secular like Camus and Sartre, that they're accenting our finitude and our inability to fully grasp the ultimate nature, reality, the truth about things. And therefore, there you talk about truth being tied to the way to truth. Because once you give up on the notion of fully grasping the way the world is, you're going to talk about what are the ways in which I can sustain my quest for truth. How do you sustain a journey, a path toward truth, the way to truth? So the truth talk goes hand in hand with talk about the way to truth. And scientists could talk about this in terms of, adducing evidence and drawing reliable conclusions and so forth and so on. Religious folk could talk about this in terms of surrendering one's arrogance and pride in the face of divine revelation and what have you. But they're all ways of acknowledging our finitude and our fallibility. I want all of the rich historical colorations to be manifest in talking about our finitude. Being born of a woman in stank and stench, what I'd call funk. Being introduced to the funk of life in the womb and the love push that gets you out. Right? And then your body is not just death, but the way Vico talks about it. Here, Vico is so much better than Heidegger. Vico talks about it in terms of being a corpse. See, Heidegger doesn't talk about corpses. He talks about death. It's still too abstract. Absolutely. Read the poetry of John Donne. He'll tell you about corpses that decompose. Well, see, that's history. That's the raw, funky, stanky stuff of life. That's what bluesmen do. You see, that's what jazzmen do. See, I'm a blues man in the life of the mind. I'm a jazz man in the world of ideas. Therefore, for me, music is central. So when you're talking about poetry, for the most part, Plato was talking primarily about words, whereas I talk about notes, I talk about tone, I talk about temper, I talk about rhythms. See, for me, music is fundamental. Philosophy must go to school not only with the poets, philosophy needs to go to school with the musicians. Keep in mind, Plato bans the flute in the Republic, but not the lyre. Why? Because the flute appeals to all of these various sides of who we are, given his tripartite conception of the soul, the rational and the spirited and the appetitive. And the flute appeals to all three of those, where he thinks the lyre on one string only appeals to one, and therefore is permissible. Now, of course, the irony is when Plato was on his deathbed, what did he do? Well, he requested the Thracian girl to play music on the flute. I'm a Christian, but I'm not a Puritan. I believe in pleasure. And orgiastic pleasure has its place. Intellectual pleasure has its place. Social pleasure has its place. Televisual pleasure has its place. I like certain TV shows. My God, when it comes to music, Beethoven's 32nd Sonata, Opus 111, unbelievable aesthetic pleasure. Same would be true for Curtis Mayfield, the Beatles, or what have you. There's a certain pleasure of the life of the mind that cannot be denied. It's true that you might be socially isolated because you're in the library at home and so on, but you're intensely alive. In fact, you're much more alive than these folk walking these streets of New York in crowds, which is no intellectual interrogation and questioning going at all. But if you read, John Ruskin, or you read a Mark Twain, or my God, Herman Melville, you almost had to throw the book against the wall because you're almost so intensely alive that you need a break.
You get electrified.
Exactly. It's time to take a break and get a little dullness in your life, Take Moby Dick, throw it against the wall the way Goethe threw von Gleiss's work against the wall. It was just too much. It reminded Goethe of the darkness that he was escaping after he overcame those suicidal impulses we saw as a young brother in the 1770s and made his move toward neoclassicism in Weimar. There are certain things that make us too alive, almost. It's almost like being too intensely in love. You can't do anything. It's hard to get back to Chronos, and hard to get back to everyday life, you know what I mean? That kairotic dimension of being in love with another person. Everything is so meaningful, you want to sustain it. You just can't do it, you know? You got to go to the bathroom, have a drink of water, shit.